Welcome to week 4 of Psych 543. This week we are going to focus on sex and porn addictions. So to get us started, I want to take a second and think about what we often think about when we hear these terms. So I know that when I wasn't well educated on these forms of addiction, I didn't have an accurate idea of what they were and what they came with. So sex and porn addictions are complex addictions. And just with all addictions, if you scratch the surface, uh, there's a trauma base. So a lot of these individuals were sexually abused themselves. Sexual addictions are more closely knit with that because sexuality can actually trigger that trauma. So even though these individuals are engaging in a lot of sexual acts, afterwards they feel guilt and shame, but they also may be triggered from their historical abuse. So sex is an activity that promotes the survival of species. So our brain rewards this activity with dopamine, just like it does when we eat or drink a glass of water when we're really thirsty. The brain reward system makes us vulnerable to addiction, like we've learned the past few weeks. So people are not addicted to sex per se, rather they're addicted to the brain chemicals released during the activity. So this week for the PowerPoint, I'm just going to highlight some key areas and some important details that you need to leave this class with a solid foundation of what sex and porn addictions are. I know you have a lot of reading this week. You have a full chapter as well as 3 articles, so I try to be cognizant and mindful of all that's on your load. So I just want to highlight some areas. We will mainly focus on the biological pieces, but it's really important, especially if you want to become a Christian counselor, to broaden your knowledge on the Christian kind of outlook on these addictions. And I'm going to give you a resource on this if you're interested, but I'll get more into that as we get closer to the end here. So what is sexual addiction? Sexual addiction is best described as a progressive intimacy disorder characterized by compulsive sexual thoughts and acts. So there's a high preoccupation with the act of sex. It's not even necessarily the orgasm that the individual is looking for. It's more so the process of it, the arousal, that is what they're addicted to. As with all addictions, there are negative consequences to these. You could imagine what it does to someone's family or themselves, their self-esteem takes up a lot of their time. They might get in trouble at work because they're going on unauthorized websites. They might not be able to get their work tasks done. So that's a lot of overlap as we see in substance addictions. There's also, as the addiction progresses, the addict usually has to intensify the addictive behavior and the sexual act to achieve the same result. So what does that sound like? That's tolerance, right? So the person needs more as they continue with the addiction and as the addiction progresses. This disorder, this particular addiction, has a high shame background, more so than others, because sexuality is highly intimate and has a lot to do with our sense of self. So there's a lot of secrecy here. As I stated, there's emotional and sexual abuse in their background. Someone who was raised in a non-traumatic background and had, a firm and stable household probably isn't going to go on to develop a sexual addiction. There's a lot of highly sexualized behaviors and a lot of preoccupation, a lot of hyperarousal, and these addictions are comorbid with other psychiatric disorders such as depression or anxiety. Now, I want to take a moment to differentiate between sexual addiction and sex offending. Sex addicts do not necessarily move on to become sex offenders, and not all sex offenders are sex addicts. Of course, there are cases where a sex offender is a sex addict, or a sex addict goes on and becomes a sex offender, but there's a big misconception here in that a lot of times when people hear that someone's addicted to sex, they believe that that means that they're a pedophile or they've committed a sexual offense, when that's not necessarily true. About 55% of convicted sex offenders can be considered sex addicts. So the DSM-5 actually does not list hypersexual behavior disorder as a diagnosis. Now, there are possibilities. So if you're seeing this, if you're assessing someone who you are thinking might have a sexual addiction, your options would be other specified disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder, other specified sexual dysfunction, and unspecified paraphilic disorder. So you will get more into detail if you have not already taken psychopathology, but there are, just because it's not its own diagnosis, you could still kind of make do with these options. But it's very, very vital, you guys, to rule out or rule in differentiating diagnoses. So one would be antisocial or narcissistic personality disorder. The next would be paraphilia. So paraphilia is not a sexual addiction. We'll get more into that in a second. Bipolar disorder. Now, if someone's only engaging in sexual promiscuous acts when they're manic, that is certainly very likely to be due to their mania. So you want to assess whether, when you're not in your manic state, are you still participating in these sexual acts. PTSD is another one you might want to rule out or in. Substance-induced disorder. So maybe someone is only hypersexual when they are under the influence. So you really want to kind of hone in on whether they are committing these acts when they are sober. OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. Someone they might have a obsessive or compulsive behavior that's sexual, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are a sex addict. So you want to get more information there. And also delirium, dementia, and other cognitive disorders you would want to rule out. So as I stated, paraphilias are not sex addictions. The DSM-5 paraphilias include exhibitionism, fetishism, frauderism, pedophilia, sexual masochism, sexual sadism, voyeurism, and transvestic fetishism. For some sex addictions, behavior does not progress beyond compulsive masturbation or the extensive use of pornography or phone or computer services. For others, addiction can involve illegal activities such as exhibitionism, voyeurism, obscene phone calls, even child molestation or rape. So you could kind of see here there is a wide spectrum of what can be considered a sexual addiction. The sexual activity might include high levels of fantasy, which may be more important than the activity themselves, like I said. So someone, it just might be the idea of it or the kind of the period leading up to the sex. There may be a form of keeping score about the number of sexual conquests. Sexual activities may be limited to a very narrow range of activities. These activities can interfere with other more wholesome enjoyment of sex. So let me give you an example here. A heavy user of pornography, so someone who's watching a lot of porn, coupled with masturbation, so they're masturbating to porn regularly, probably excessively, they may be unable to actually achieve an erection or orgasm with their partner. So you can imagine how that affects their relationship and the intimacy with their partner. Sexual activity may be pursued in a purposeful, goal-oriented manner, such as going to clubs during specific nights to pick up partners, or it may be a more impulsive act, such as cruising is a term, when their cravings become strong. So the etiology is important to keep in mind here. You're going to see a lot if you decide to specialize in sex addictions, or you come across one or two clients, it's very likely that they are coming from a high trauma background. There's a lot of biology, neuroscience, and sexual conditioning that come along with these, as well as family dynamics and attachment styles. So please read your articles, because there's a lot of information on how someone's family dynamics and their attachment with their parents plays a role in these addictions. So just breakdown in statistics, 72% experience physical abuse, 81% has experienced sexual abuse, and 97% have experienced emotional abuse. So these are very, very high numbers. They also came from families that were, where there was a big shame component. So they might have come with, family where addiction was present, but it was just not talked about. So they have learned to keep their secret a secret and not let anyone in on this. And I just want to take a minute to kind of differentiate between shame and guilt. Both are bad, both have negative consequences, but shame is dangerous, you guys. So guilt is saying I did something wrong, where shame is saying I am something wrong. Guilt is saying I did something bad. Shame is saying I am bad. So this really diminishes someone's sense of self and leads to feeling unworthy and very, very low self-esteem. So like we know, addictions start in the reward center, connects to the VTA, to the nucleus accumbens, which is tied to impulsivity, pleasure, reinforcement, learning, and reward. Sex and porn addictions, like other addictions, interact with the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. These areas modulate pleasure, memory, attention, and motivation. So what chemical is being released here? Hopefully you guys thought of dopamine, right? All about dopamine, which gives us the pleasure sensation. Treatment, and we will get into treatment later on in the semester, but there are different options. Group, 12-step support, mindfulness, CBT. We'll talk a lot about mindfulness in here. Trauma treatment, such as EMDR. Families and couples treatment, partner trauma treatment. And it all starts with disclosure, you guys, right? It takes a very courageous person to tell someone. So therefore, the therapist and client relationship is crucial, right? Because if there's no trust, then it's very unlikely that the person is going to share their most darkest, intimate part about themselves. So it really starts with a strong bond between the client and the therapist, as well as group members. Group is big because it, first of all, normalizes the person's experience. Hey, I'm not alone in this. Other people go through this. It's not just me. And they develop outside community resources beyond just the therapist. So we know as therapists who are in training that we can't have any personal relationships with our clients, right? It has to remain professional. So we have very limited time with our clients. We see them typically 1 hour a week. And there's a lot of life outside that counseling room, right? 1 hour a week is hardly anything. So things are inevitably going to come up, triggers, setbacks for these clients. If they have group members or a sponsor, it's ethical to contact them, right? Whereas us, they could contact us if they're in a state of crisis or emergency. It's a little gray depending on what your standards are, but we certainly should not be talking to clients, multiple times a day. So it's really good to introduce them to a support system beyond just the therapist-client relationship. So I want to take a minute and think about why sex is different than other addictions. So while there are similarities, the same compulsive behavior that characterizes other addictions also is typical of sex addictions, right? So the fantasizing, the increased need for more to get the same original pleasure response, the negative consequences it comes with, all of that is the same. But other addictions like drugs, alcohol, and gambling dependency involves substances or activities with no necessary relationship to our survival, right? We could live a life without all of these things. We don't have to drink alcohol. We don't have to gamble. We don't have to use drugs. But like eating, having sex is necessary for human survival. Although there are circumstances where people choose to be celibate or have some type of religious or cultural reason why they are going to abstain from sex. But for the most part, average healthy human has a strong desire for sex. And actually, if someone is not having any urges to have sex or aren't being aroused beyond, because of a cultural, religious, or a choice to be celibate, it's usually likely to a medical condition. So, sex is a part of survival. So this is something that someone has to learn to have a healthy and engage in a healthy amount of it, which kind of makes the treatment more difficult, right? Just like with eating disorders, you need food to survive. Therefore, we have to learn to eat in a healthy manner. So it goes beyond just, cutting off of it completely, because that's not realistic. So I want to leave you with that and leave you with, how does that add an extra layer of the difficulty in recovering from a sex addiction? And as a part of these two, or this lecture, I want you to watch these two videos. The first is a little longer. It's about 35 minutes. The second is very short. It is a documentary. It's only about less than 10 minutes. So in total, these videos are about 45 minutes. That's why I wanted to keep the lecture short. And I have also provided a ebook titled Your Brain on Porn, 5 Proven Ways Pornography Warps Your Mind and 5 Biblical Ways to Renew It. It's very important if you are a Christian or plan on being a Christian counselor to learn Christianity's view on this and the approach they take on this. So this is a very good ebook that I know you probably won't have time to go through it in detail, but save it to your desktop, because it's a good, as novice therapists, you're always wanting to build your library and your resources. So this is a really good ebook, and I've attached it under this week's lecture. Okay, so I'm looking forward to reading your discussions this week. Please reach out with any questions or concerns, and I will see you in week 5. Oh, one more thing, you guys. Before we exit, I want you to think about how your perspective has changed on sex and porn addictions after reading all the material, listening to this lecture, and watching the videos. did it change completely? Did it not change at all? Do you have more empathy towards these people? I just want you to kind of compare where you were at to where you are now.